So, welcome back to Honored Madman. I hope everybody's doing well. I noticed a while back that almost every single demigod leaves behind some kind of corpse or remains of their physical form. Dead demigods are a bit of a touchy subject in the lands between because of the death of Godwyn, mainly because he became this cancer of death that infected the entire world, but that's something we'll get into later. Now, after Godwyn died, when another demigod would die, they'd be laid to rest in a wandering mausoleum. I mean, you've seen them everywhere, you know them, they duplicate remembrances. And this is done so that the dead demigod does not infect the roots of the great tree that the Erd-tree has co-opted with Deathroot, just like Godwyn did. This was, of course, before the entirety of the Golden Order and the world began falling apart. These dead demigods were protected by their loyal soldiers and knights who chose to follow them into death by carrying out a really fucking metal ritual that involves beheading themselves with this sacrificial axe. Basically, it turns them into these phantom headless knights. Some of them even brought their horses into the afterlife with them, but they're essentially the eternal guardians of their chosen dead demigod. Of course, fast forward to the events of the game, and again, society has fallen apart. And there's no one to lay to rest the demigods that we're going to be dropping throughout the story. Now, some of the demigods don't leave any remains behind, but even that can be explained, well, for the most part. But we're going to start with the ones who have very tangible corpses and or remains, you know, the obvious ones. And of course, not every demigod is a boss or even a shard bearer. The only thing that really qualifies one being a demigod is being the offspring of either Marika or Radahn, or by being Godfrey, who was basically just a regular human dude but immensely powerful and was able to bang a god. He was the first Elden Lord if you don't count Placidusix, and I do believe there is text referring to him as a demigod specifically, that like when he married Marika he became a demigod. I can't be too sure though, I'm just saying we're going to include him in this. And as far as demigods being shard bearers go, there were a handful of them who aren't shard bearers because they didn't participate in the shattering. I mean, Ranni's technically not even a shard bearer since she cast her great rune aside, but she is an Empyrean, or was until she killed her Empyrean flesh. Miquella as well cast aside his great rune, which we can find as a sort of talisman in the game. Then there's Mesmer, who, as far as I can tell, wasn't given any kind of great rune or anything like that, so he isn't a shard bearer. And Melina, we can go tit for tat if she was, because she's technically supposed to be the maiden of destined death, so in theory the rune of death should be her great rune, so she should technically be a shard bearer. I'm probably making all this more confusing than it even initially was. But anyway, I've lumped all of the demigods into one of three groups. You know, depending on their cultural heritage, of course. There's the Golden Lineage, the Carrion siblings, and then there's the Children of Marika and Radahn, which I've split into two subcategories, being the twin prodigies of Malenia and Miquella, and the more mysterious Children of Fire, Mesmer and Melina. So let's start with the Golden Lineage of Marika and Godfrey, because I figure we can cover the most bases with that one. We've talked a little bit about these guys in the past. They are the direct offspring and the descendants of Marika and Godfrey. In-game, it's sort of the surviving remnants of their dynasty. Godfrey is technically a demigod as well, or at least he became one after banging an actual god. He was also an extremely savage fighter, quite possibly the greatest warrior the lands between had ever seen. He had this taste for bloodshed that he just couldn't quench.
I don't kill for pleasure, unlike some.
Well, you should try someday, you might get a taste for it.
He was, however, stripped of his grace and his demigod status when he was sent back to the Badlands with the Tarnished. And while he was there, he fought, lived, died, and became stronger, and eventually made his way back to the lands between. And after he's killed, he does not leave behind any corpse or remains or anything for us to talk to. And unfortunately for Godfrey, his legacy is reflected by the Golden Lineage, and his results were a little less than stellar. Ultimately, he had only one true successor, a battlefield daughter he presumably sired in the Badlands either prior to meeting Marika or after. I'm not really sure how all that works. I'm of course referring to Nepheli-Loux, who was taken in and raised by Gideon Ofnir, the all-knowing of the Round Table Hold, and he sort of viewed her as a useful pawn up until a point. You know, once she discovered how ruthless he was, burning and destroying villages, and showed that she had a bit of a conscience, he had no use for her anymore and cast her aside. And if you decide to not give Nepheli that potion from Celibus, she winds up being the ruler of Limgrave, the seat of the storm in the end, pledging allegiance to the character as a vassal. She's actually one of the few characters in the FromSoft games as a whole to actually get a happy ending of some kind. And shit, even her dirtbag nephew Gostock gets a happy ending as her little assistant. I mean, everybody's happy there in Stormvale Castle at the end of the game. But I know this video is supposed to be about corpses, and the first entry I'm talking about don't even leave one. I just felt the need to briefly talk about Godfrey because he technically counted as demigod, but that's sort of arbitrary, I get that. So let's get to his golden lineage proper, shall we?
Starting with Godwyn the Golden.
He's dead.
So out of all the demigod corpses that are left behind, only one of them is gigantic and spreading across the root system of the lands between like a virus. And I understand it's technically the death root that is spreading through the roots, but the death root was created by the curse mark that was carved into Godwyn's flesh that is sort of mutating and going all out of whack now because America had death suppressed. Whole lot of cause and effect in this game. But let's examine his actual corpse now, shall we, because it is something else. So you can still see the blonde hair and where the face used to be, but you can also see the basilisk legs and the basilisk false eyes popping up. I think those legs in particular are his original limbs that are sort of contorting and mutating into basilisk legs. Then we've got the lower half where it looks like he's turning into a full-on merman. It appears as though part of this was a blue shroud that was draped over his corpse when he was placed at the roots of the great tree. What a great idea that was. But you can see the fabric quickly turns into scales and it kind of becomes some mixed match of both a shroud and a new fishy kind of lower half. I was mentioning earlier about how his corpse is spreading through the lands between. And I did mean it literally, although it probably would have been more accurate to say it's his face that's spreading everywhere. It can be viewed on the back of death-blighted crabs, and in extreme cases it can appear in these gigantic forms, you know, just like a copy of his face, like another of his face. The best example is famously underneath Stormvale Castle, but there's also a few of them in the Shadow Realm as well, where they're guarded by Death Knights, and they're referred to as cadaver surrogates. I think that they're either a piece of Godwyn's corpse or another corpse that Godwyn's mutation has infected that they bring to other places to spread his influence to, in hopes that they can help usher in an age of death. That's what it says about the Death Knights. And Godwyn's entire legacy is sort of reflected by those who live in death. And I don't think he asked for any of this. I don't think it was his desire to be the patron saint of skeletons, or again for his legacy to be as a prince of death and to have a lineage, the golden lineage, that produced pathetic individuals like Godrick and Godfrey. He almost feels like one of the more George Martinian characters from the mythos. I understand that he wrote like their background before the great runes made them all twisted and malformed. But in many ways, Godwyn reminds me of like the Rykard Targaryen of the story. He's dead before we get to, interact with the narrative. He's remembered extremely fondly, and his death was a major catalyst for the events that led to the current state of the lands between. He's also blonde hair and has a association with dragons. Anyway, I don't want to get too off topic here. So although his corpse remains spreading across the continent in the form of Deathroot, there is a few good aspects to his legacy. Chief among these would probably be his kinship with dragons, which was not something he easily attained. He fought the dragons to the last man until him and the final dragon were at each other's throats and they decided to just become friends. And because he was probably America's favorite, she was kind of cool with him taking his own actions in these situations. A whole cult was created because he befriended Fortisax, and it sort of allowed the dragons into the Golden Order. And this, of course, would have several ripple effects like the draconic tree sentinels, dragons like Lanisax living as humans to lead the cult. After a while, basically every Knight of Landel was a member of the Dragon Cult, so I'd say that's one bright point of Godwyn's legacy. I mean, look how powerful they are. Look how synonymous Lightning is with Landel by this point. And that wouldn't be possible without Godwyn. Godwyn's also got children in the form of basilisks, as I mentioned earlier. They're basically his unwilling offspring that spread Deathblight across the lands. And how can I forget, he of course produces through Fia a mending rune to fix the Elden Ring and allow those who live in death back into the Golden Order, the new one, the age of the Duskborn. One of my favorite endings because it finally gives all the undead monsters and creatures some kind of a purpose in the New Order, and they're not just forced to exist without purpose. And more importantly, without leadership. I mean, that's why the Tibia Mariners were able to take power and cause such a nuisance. Anyway, though, Godwyn was American Godfrey's only child who wasn't cursed. The other two, however, are still technically a part of the Golden lineage. But they were kept secret. They were forced to live in the sewers of Landel beneath the capital. Despite Marika being ashamed of them, their father Godfrey seemed to be rather fond of them, at least Morgott. I have really no reason to believe he wasn't also kind to Mogh as well, but we just don't see them interact like we do with him and Morgott. Mogh was sort of like the rebel of the family.
Give me the blood, Eli. Let me get out of here. Give me the blood, Lord, and let me get away.
Since he and his brother Morgott were born omens, they have all these really painful looking horns coming out of them, and Mogh can even manifest wings. But when it comes to leaving remains behind, Mogh is sort of an interesting case. His body's actually missing from the main game because his remains were stolen by another demigod named Miquella. And this was mainly done so that Miquella could resurrect his true lord Radahn in Mogh's lifeless body. But Mogh wasn't chosen at random. His body was stolen simply because he was originally born with the divine tanglehorns that are associated with divinity and spirituality, and they're sort of like this medium for spirit calling, which I imagine made the spirit transplant easier, but more than that, it also sort of redeemed the horn scent that the new god of the New Age was selecting, a tangle-horned lord. I'm sure there were other factors involved as well. Mogh happened to be a demigod. He was also one of the sons of Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, and basically the epitome of what it meant to be a man in the Lands Between. A big tough guy. Godfrey also happened to be Radahn's idol, so how about that? Radahn gets to be resurrected in the body of his hero. Which, now that I think about it, seems like a really odd gift from Miquella to give to Radahn. Like, yes, of course, now you are the legacy of the lion. It seems like all these things naturally made poor Mogh here the perfect vessel for Miquella to resurrect Radahn and allegedly right all these wrongs of his mother's past, her persecution of both the Hornsent and the Giants in particular. And in all fairness, Mogh basically played right into Miquella's hands by kidnapping him, which is what ultimately leads to his death and the desecration of his corpse. So yeah, Mogh's remains were commandeered by Miquella, who then proceeded to shove Radahn's soul into him, which clearly altered the way they look. It looks like he lost his main head horn, which I think also seems to have resulted in Radahn having one eye when he reincarnates. But he's still got Mogh's trademark black horns on his elbows and arms, and I think his legs as well. And of course the brute strength of an omen. Now, what remains of his legacy can be found in those who accepted his blood, like the Albinorics, who really took to the cursed blood. I mean, look at these guys. They grew horns, and some of them were even granted minor spirit-calling abilities. The same goes for his disciples, the Sanguine Nobles and the Bloody Fingers. They all carry his blood, so in a way they carry on his legacy. And Mogh does have one thing that others don't, and that's just simply an extremely cool knight who is honor-bound to avenge his dignity. So, small victories. Now, the other brother of this omen twin duo is a polar opposite to Mogh.
Ever you desire to appear lordly and gracious as a king of old.
See, where the Lord of Blood truly embraced his omenism and his cursed blood and rejected the Erdtree and the Golden Order, Morgott, aka Morgott the Fell Omen, he was deeply ashamed of the fact he was an omen. He resented his cursed blood. Despite his unfortunate condition, he was still really obsessed with his perceived duty to protect Landel, and when the Shattering Wars broke out, he climbed out of the sewers and rose to the occasion as its last defender. And at no point did he love the Erdtree or expect any love back. He just did it because he knew it was his duty. He could finally receive some shred of his birthright, even if the Erdtree ultimately denied him. I mean, this was really a cursed omen who still served the Erdtree that shunned him just because he was born with horns and a tail. He can be encountered a total of 3 times, and he's somewhat like a bit of a rival to the player, which I really appreciated. Towards the end of his final boss fight, he finally expels all of his cursed blood, and eventually dies shortly after, laughing at the player, leaving a hornless, seemingly curse-free corpse behind for his father to mourn when he finally returns with that pack of cigarettes. And that is, of course, just my speculation for why his corpse has no horns and no tail. It's almost as if, upon his death, all traces of the Crucible and, supposed divinity left him. And then by the time Godfrey finds him, everything's burning away, and just like everything else, Morgott sort of just like fades out. At least Godfrey got to say goodbye. But as far as Morgott's legacy goes, it extends to the development of the Sentry Torch, something he came up with after the Night of Black Knives and the death of his brother Godwyn. He vowed that such a thing would never happen again, and those Sentry Torches were a way of ensuring it. Aside from that, he also sent out the Hands of the Fell Omen, or the Knights Cavalry. Extremely elite knights who still patrol the lands between to this day on orders from Morgott. They're very skilled fighters, and they only come out at night. They act essentially as extensions of the Fell Omen himself, and carry out his justice accordingly. Now, Morgott and Mogh were essentially secret members of the Golden Lineage, and there were also a number of unknown relatives that they had, whether they knew them or not, or whether they died in the Shattering. It's sort of up in the air. Somewhere down the line, they got really into grafting, which could have been influenced by Godfrey's own grafting of Sarosh the Lion onto his back, and that was only done to contain his savagery so he can conduct himself as a lord, because the Badlands warrior Horalu was literally an animal in human form. So he needed to be tamed, in a sense, by a civilized spirit animal. In this case, Sarosh. You guys know the gist. But like all things over time, the obsession with grafting became more and more disgusting and bastardized, to the point where we have Godrick.
A lion doesn't concern himself with the opinions of the sheep.
Who is referred to as the last of the Golden Lineage, but there are a number of grafted scions who likely have even more diluted blood than Godrick's, but still count as Golden Lineage members who are running around in the game world. But Godrick's an interesting case. This is a guy who fled from Leyndell when Radahn was attacking it, and then got defeated by Malenia over at Stormvale, and was only spared because he begged for his life and kissed her boots, and she probably didn't feel like he was worth dirtying her blade. But Godrick here was really obsessed with grafting. He grafted a dragon's head onto his arm and a million different limbs from his servants and distant relatives. And his grafting in general was all in a vain attempt to achieve a fraction of the strength that resided in his very diluted bloodline, the strength of Godfrey and the strength of Marika, individuals who Godrick really had no right being a descendant of. The guy was obsessed with stealing power from anybody who was weaker than him in the most bizarrest ways possible. Grafting, and I also think there's no way he slew that dragon, small and malnourished as it looked. So he turned to grafting because he lacked strength. Strength he felt like he was owed because of who he had descended from. But after his boss fight, he leaves behind some remains. In fact, he might have left behind the smallest piece of remains out of any demigod. It seems as though in between us defeating him and returning to check up on him, Godrick's servants have ripped him limb from grafted limb after his untimely demise. When we show up, only Gostock remains, stomping on Godrick's very dead head and upper torso. And the interesting thing about Gostock, the grave robber here, is that he might just be Godrick's bastard son. I think some data miner found that there was a whole cut quest line involving Gostock that he would take over after you defeated Godrick, or you had a choice to either select him or Nephili. And I think the idea was that if you selected helping Gostock, that he would eventually become just as bad as Godrick, culminating in some sort of a boss fight where you'd have to put him down. No confirmation of this made it in-game, but I like to think his eyes are kind of like a faded, tarnished color, not like bright gold like Kenneth hates, but it was enough for me to get behind this theory pretty early on when I saw it. So ultimately, Godrick leaves behind a son whose arm he'd sliced off and grafted, and also a huge mess for Nephili and Kenneth to clean up at Stormvale. Corpses and limbs hanging from rafters. He and his men were incredibly ineffective at combating the demi-humans of Limgrave, and the Weeping Peninsula had a full-scale rebellion on its hands with the Misbegotten taking over Castle Morn. I'd imagine it's going to take quite a while for Nephili and the current rulers of Limgrave to fix everything that he fucked up. It's no wonder that he's pretty much despised and not remembered too fondly. He's remembered as the demigod who snuck out of Leyndell wearing a dress. He begged for his life after getting pieced up by Malenia. I think I already mentioned these two things. He probably has the worst legacy out of all these guys I'm going to mention. And as for his corpse, it pretty much stays there for the rest of the game. Everything that was grafted onto it has now been removed, and all that remains is that slight upper torso and his head with, I believe, his crown still on. He definitely had one of the more poetic deaths of all from Software. He treated his staff horrible and grafted most of them. I can totally imagine the scene where about 100 of his servants, a mob of them if you will, completely just swarm him and just rip him piece from piece, throwing clothes, limbs everywhere. It probably was a glorious sight. But that's enough rambling on that subject for now. Let's move on to the Carian demigods, perhaps the coolest faction in the House of Caria. Your mileage may vary. I don't even use sorcery and I like them. So let's start with Radahn, since I already kind of talked about how his where his soul ends up.
Talking to me about the laws of the jungle. What was it? Something about being beneath me? Silver on back? There's only one rule in this fucking jungle. When the lion's hungry, he eats.
So we know where his spirit ended up, but what happened to his corpse? So Radahn was famously the strongest demigod who went up against Malenia and got nuked. He survived, but it turned him into a mindless beast who went around just eating everything he could find. His buddy Jaren put this really metal festival together to honor him, and how they went about honoring him was attempting to kill him yearly, and one day they succeeded with the help of a nameless tarnish that we play as. Now, among the participants in this festival was none other than the famous warrior jar, Iron Fist Alexander. Now, after the glorious boss fight that ended in fireworks, Radahn's original remains were actually harvested by this very same warrior jar. And Iron Fist Alexander, he was prolific. After harvesting Radahn, he went on to harvest a fire giant, the last of the fire giants. However, he would eventually meet his end in crumbling Farum Azula at the hands of his good buddy, that nameless Tarnished I mentioned earlier. So Alexander was destroyed, but his innards, which contained Radahn's remains as well as those of the last fire giant, were collected and delivered to Alexander's nephew, a young warrior jar named Jarbairn, which basically means jar baby. And this little dude was destined to carry on Alexander's legacy as well as that of Radahn's. I actually made a short little video about this, I think 2 years ago, maybe even longer, maybe 2.5 years ago. I probably hadn't figured out recording and editing yet, but I think the video probably holds up. But my main basis for that theory is there's a chunk that you can see in the Alexander's shard. It looks like a piece of Radahn's armor, and if you look at Radahn's armor, it's also missing a similarly shaped chunk, so I think it's definitely a possibility. What's left of Radahn's legacy is reflected in his surviving men and the specific Redmane Knights that he went to sorcery school with back in Sellia. He happens to be one of the few demigods whose actions have had an impact on the cosmos, possibly even more so than his actions on the Lands Between. His imprisoning of the stars had all these major ramifications for the other demigods, namely the Empyreans, whose fates were effectively frozen when he decided to challenge and conquer the stars. It was said that he did this to save Sellia, the sorcery town, which still stands pretty tall today, if not a bit overgrown by scarlet rot plants. But it also meant that if any of these prospective Empyreans wanted to ascend and achieve godhood, then Radahn would have to die before that was possible. Because even in his altered, animalistic state, his passive effect of keeping the stars in prison is still active, and unsurprisingly, it only goes away with his death. But let's move on to his sister Ranni, the witch.
Hey, you guys! I tell you what, you win. I'm a witch, okay? I'm a witch! And I curse both of you and all of your stupid guns.
So she's also a bit different than some of these other entries in this list because she never really dies in game. What happened was Ranni killed her physical form herself with the Rune of Death and left it behind at her divine tower. You can actually go visit her body at any time and look at it. It looks like it's sort of crumbling away. She currently lives on as a ghost. This makes it easier to carry on her work with the assistance of a small band of loyalists. And while Ranni's mom, Rennala, doesn't die in any way in the story, in many ways Ranni is the legacy of the Carian royal family as a whole, or at least it's like she's like the personified form of it, especially in her opposition of the Golden Order and the Erd Tree and the Fingers. And as we all know, she even gets her own ending where she gets to take over everything. I think her impact and legacy sort of go without saying. Not to the degree of, say, Queen Marika, but she's definitely followed in the footsteps of Marika, just while making different choices, whether she realizes it or not. The difference appears to be that Ranni retains some of her humanity. She truly did love Blythe and Iji, and was heartbroken because she knew what would happen after she went on her journey. That's what I think, at least. But that's enough rambling about that. Let's talk about my favorite demigod, because he leaves a hell of a corpse behind too. So Praetor Rykard fed himself to a snake long ago and sort of merged with it, and together they ate countless others, presumably most of Rykard's knights and pretty much any champion who was dumb enough to step into that snake chamber. But after Rykard was eventually killed, only his head remained, with bits of the serpent still very visibly alive, writhing, like still very much attached to his face, still very much part of Rykard and part of the serpent. And what happens after is actually a bit like the situation I described with Alexander the Jar and Radahn's remains earlier. Rykard's legacy is carried on by Tanith, literally the most loyal woman ever. So Tanith was a dancer who Rykard met in his travels, and he must have really admired her because he made her his consort, and the two co-ruled his domain right up until Rykard fed himself to that blasphemous serpent, or as I like to call it, ascended to a higher plane. And after that, she took over, becoming the steward of Volcano Manor as well as its de facto leader in Rykard's name. Now fast forward up to Rykard's demise, and Tanith consumes him, carrying on the tradition of the manor and allowing Rykard and the Serpent family to continue to exist, inheriting them, if you will. We last see her begging for the Serpent and Rykard to find purchase within her, and honestly, why wouldn't it? And of course, like many of the other demigods, his legacy is also reflected in the landscape of his domain, in this case, Mount Gelmir, and how it was turned into one of the worst battlegrounds in the history of the Lands Between. This is a tricky legacy sort of situations, because he only went up against the Erdtree because he deemed what they did unfair. He deemed it all a lie. He was a champion for the people, and he kind of just took things too far. And again, sure, his actions turned Mount Gelmir into this horrific battlefield of frenzied mad soldiers eating their comrades. I think to call it the worst battlefield of the Shattering is a little bit unfair, because look at all of Caelid, but that's just me. The lore seems to give Malenia a lot of passes where it sort of doesn't with Rykard. But anyway, the last we see of him is his massive remains are being consumed by his loyal mistress Tanith, who I'm assuming is going to carry this serpent into the next cycle. It's basically exactly like Rykard says after you defeat him in his boss fight. Heroes get remembered, but a serpent never dies. But let's move on now to the twin prodigies.
Do you want to live forever?
We'll start with Malenia because she has her remains all in one spot, whereas Miquella's got them all over the place. The guy's got like 3 corpses. So when she's finally killed, Malenia leaves behind a bloom that she's undoubtedly inside of. Presumably she has one more bloom to go before she could truly rise as the goddess of the Scarlet Rot. She also had this sort of unclear offspring or offshoot known as Millicent, whose journey to the Haligtree sort of mirrored Malenia's initial march down when she came to conquer Radahn. Millicent can also be turned into a bud of the Scarlet Rot, and from there she's supposed to rise as a Scarlet Valkyrie when Malenia blooms the 3rd time. Ultimately, one way or another though, Millicent dies, either on her own terms by pulling out the needle that had kept her Scarlet Rot at bay, or at the hands of her sisters. She sort of rejects her destiny of being this piece of Malenia. But aside from Millicent, the Scarlet Harpy's legacy also extends to places like the Haligtree and Caelid. Her taking that long nap at the roots of the Haligtree ultimately led to its rotting decay. I mean, that coupled with Miquella being stolen. And yeah, I know he wasn't really stolen per se, but you get what I mean. It's completely Malenia's fault that the Haligtree became this hub of Scarlet Rot worship. The pests are literally building churches, they set up breeding grounds. They definitely ain't going anywhere, and I guess in a way this is more Finley's fault than it is Malenia's, Because by now I'm sure we all know the epic story of Knight Finley, a clean-rot knight who dragged Malenia back from Caelid all the way to the Halig Tree after she bloomed and was incapacitated. She laid Malenia up against the Halig Tree to heal, and, well, as you can see, that led to quite the pest infestation on the Halig Tree. In a way, it's all Finley's fault. It's like in Song of Ice and Fire, prior to the events of the story, the Mad King got himself kidnapped, and everybody was kind of like, okay, we'll just kind of let this thing happen, because he was disliked. Everybody hated the Mad King. But the leader of the King's Guard, Barristan Selmy, a guy who everybody views as honorable and the nicest of knights, he goes on a one-man rescue mission and, rescues King Aerys, which in many ways is like what a knight should be doing, especially if they're a Kingsman knight. But in a way, it also makes him complicit to all of the crimes that Aerys committed after. And I guess that's just supposed to illustrate the long-term effects of everybody's perception of honor and all that good stuff. But I'm getting off topic. Anyway, the Halig Tree, Elphael. The place has definitely got a bit of a pest problem. And this isn't even the result of a direct bloom or anything like that. Caelid, on the other hand, was ground zero for Malenia's first scarlet rot bloom. Completely dyed it red. She changed the environment on such a large scale that it gave way to species of pests being born, as I already mentioned, and these mutated mushroom men who worshipped her. I mean, really, it quite literally changed the flora and the geography of an entire region, so you gotta hand it to her. In terms of destructiveness, I think maybe she beats out Rykard, just by way of the long-term side effects of her nuking. Then there's that business with the Shaded Castle, which is only sort of her fault. Mainly because the Morai family had long been associated with the old rot cult, so the current Lord Malay Morai was no different, and he was obsessed with Malenia. I mean, he saw the possible reincarnation of the Rot Queen in his lifetime. But that place fell apart essentially because instead of doing his job as the executioner of Altus, he instead let his dungeon fill with the worst type of guys, namely Elamir the Briar, who would lead a prison riot and take over the castle, forcing the Mariah's lordling out and killing all of his loyalists and servants, his staff. Nothing really good comes from Malenia. On a side note, I think there was a bit of a missed opportunity with Malenia. I think that maybe after we defeated Ramana in the DLC, we should have been able to fight a final blue Malenia, or possibly Millicent as a Scarlet Valkyrie, since she's supposed to rise after the third bloom, but we didn't get any of that. The closest we got was that Dancer of Ranna, and that doesn't even really relate to them. It relates more to Tanith. So I thought that was kind of weak. I mean, most of the demigods had little to no presence in the DLC anyway. The only ones who got a little bit of a reference was Mogh and, Miquella, obviously, and a little bit of Godwyn reference with the cadavers and stuff like that. But the main focus seemed to be on Miquella and Radahn, with a little bit of Mogh sprinkled in, and a little bit about Saint Trina, who really isn't even a demigod, is just a part of Miquella. And that's who we're on to now, though, Miquella, the other half of the twin prodigies.
Never had a man in here before.
So, Miquella, the unalloyed, leaves behind a lot of remains. His half-grown body in the Halig Tree, which it took me forever to notice. His cocoon, all that stuff he divested himself of in the Shadow Realm, and even Saint Trina counts. So first off, the half-grown body in the Halig Tree, I'm not quite sure if it was meant to be a body or if it was meant to be, representative of him growing the Halig Tree, that the Halig Tree is grown in his image. Or was that the adult body he was trying to grow for himself, but ultimately was cut out by Mogh before that could happen? However, that was all his plan in the first place, so maybe he knew the Halig Tree wasn't going to work out. It's a pretty cool design, though. I imagine he would have been a titan had he ever finished growing it, or had this little tree growing plan worked. People have gone at length analyzing the remains that reside in his cocoon, and that corpse was huge too, so I'd imagine Miquella was quite the titan in all of his forms. He also divested himself of the rest of his physical form, whatever that looked like, on his way through the Shadow Realm. Among those was Saint Trina, who isn't really very large. We get to meet her right up close and personal, and she's pretty normal sized. But anyway, after we finally kill this sanctimonious twink, Miquella, Saint Trina finally dies, and she leaves behind this single purple blossom. This is basically the final remains of Miquella, who by this point is fully destroyed, completely eradicated, wiped from the plane of existence. And not only that, but his legacy too. I mean, it's one of failure. The Halleck tree, becoming a god, curing Godwyn and his sister, who he pretty much didn't care about at all since he was willing to sacrifice her to Radahn. I mean, he really failed at everything. When you think about it, it must have been a pretty weird thing to literally have the power to bewitch people and make them do your bidding unquestionably. There's no way you're not going to end up abusing it, even if you're telling yourself you're doing good and redeeming your evil war crime committing mom by stuffing the soul of your dead half-brother into the corpse of your dead stepbrother. Miquella isn't a hero. He isn't the secret protagonist of the story. He's an antagonist. He's the antagonist, the final one. Who even knows what an age of compassion would look like, especially if it's all forced, it's not natural. He's trying to create this perfect world with no war and no chaos and no destruction, but that just isn't possible without him literally forcing everybody to be peaceful or forcing them to have compassion for one another. But yeah, just because his motives are pure, or he believes his motives are pure, doesn't make him the hero. I mean, his goal is counter to ours. He's the villain because what he wants requires us to be dead, and that's not an option. So anyway, that last flower that St. Trina left behind would technically be the very last of Miquella's remains. She was literally his other half, and she wanted him dead as well, and this conflict between two warring sides of the same whole is sort of reminiscent of Marika and Radah's struggle against each other. Two different halves of the same god vying for dominance, that type of thing. And in the end, when Miquella divested himself from St. Trina, he created a vengeance deep within her, which ultimately led to Miquella's own demise. Sort of sowed his own poison there. But that's enough about Miquella, though. I mean, we're just supposed to talk about his corpse, not how I feel about him. I should save all that for a more dedicated video to the character. So now we're on to the secret children of Queen Marika, the kids of fire. Mesmer and Melina, and neither of them leaves a corpse or remains proper, really. So first off, Mesmer here.
Call me Snake.
Only leaves behind his embers, which are then used to burn down the sealing tree of enir-ilim, which is found in Ra, the ancient ruins of. As far as legacy goes, I mean, just take a look at the current state of the Shadow Realm. That is his legacy. That is what he leaves behind after he's gone. Beyond that, his flames are carried on by his fire knights, the occasional Mesmer soldier, and this bowl-cut fanatic who stylized himself as the Impaler number 2. So while Mesmer's hands and imprints are all over the Shadow Realm, almost no trace of his existence can be found in the regular lands between that wasn't sealed off in the Shadow Realm. As far as I know, the only possible thing that relates to Mesmer in the base game is the Impaler's coffins, and that's sort of just circumstantial evidence. That might just be a coincidence. But if it's not, it could also mean that maybe he was in charge of the Weeping Peninsula at some point before he was sent away into the Shadow Realm. But even if by some wild chance that is true, it's still next to nothing to how he's perceived in the Shadow Realm. His legacy is the devastation of the Hornsent, the divine duty that his mother cursed him with. And his crusade against them was largely successful, and most importantly, it also was unending. He sort of was stuck there with all of his men waging this eternal genocide. He also concealed his true nature from his men to the point where he imprisoned the two most loyal Black Knights in his army because they unsurprisingly betrayed him after they learned of his true nature. They were deeply involved with the Crucible, and the Crucible seems to oppose the serpents. But here's the thing, I don't know why they were so surprised. I mean, the guy literally had winged serpents coming out of him, but maybe the Crucible viewed the winged serpents as good because they had wings. They had an aspect of the Crucible themselves, so they could be trusted by the Black Knights, these guys who were deeply connected to the Crucible of life, and that could be why they were so alarmed when they found out that he's not just hanging out with these winged serpents for no reason. They're actually there concealing or helping him conceal his true nature, which is basically being the host of some eldritch entity known as the Abyssal Serpent. And aside from that, Mesmer may have also inspired the Redmane's use of fire, as Mesmer is described as an older brother, a good friend of Radahn's. Then there's their whole mutual friendship with the Albinoric warrior known as Gaius. It just seems like in their darkest hour, the Redmanes likely thought of Radahn, their lord's older brother Mesmer, who was associated with flame, and used that as a way to fight off the Scarlet Rot. He also may have inspired the imagery of the depraved perfumer's outfits, or at least that little design on their apron. It's got both fire and serpents sort of swirling around the Erd Tree. Now, I know that doesn't add up one-to-one with Mesmer, who was loyal to the Erd Tree, but perhaps these guys, they were loyal to the abyssal serpent. Or maybe it's just Iglay, or maybe they're loyal to both of the serpents, because I believe there's actually 2 serpents on their little outfit, and the color is red. So it's at least somewhat possible. I like to think they're connected to both Iglay and the abyssal serpent, and they worship them both. They just really, they're anti-Erd Tree, the depraved perfumers. But that's enough on Mesmer for now.
I found the kittens! Oh, come on!
Let's get to Melina, who didn't have much of a physical form left in the first place when we meet her, and it's not really surprising that she doesn't leave any remains outside possibly her Glowm eye. She does, however, leave behind her actions, like many of the other people we mentioned on this list. For example, she either burns the Erd Tree, commits cardinal sin, something that has major implications for the world and world logic moving forward. And if she's denied that destiny, then she survives the entirety of the game and lives to hunt the player down for ending the world. She only survives the game, though, if you burn the Erd Tree with the Flame of Frenzy. If you, for example, have her burn the tree and then go inherit the Frenzied Flame, she isn't alive to hunt you down, so I guess it's a win-win, and you've completely eradicated her besides that beast eye. If, of course, that is her eye. Aside from all that, though, her legacy is probably carried on the best by the Godskin apostles and nobles, her children, if you will. She swaddled them in cloth made from the skins of gods and gave them their purpose to hunt down and skin the gods, making really cool outfits for themselves in the process. And these guys were so effective at using the black flame and killing gods that they cultivated their own followers themselves as well. Groups like the Black Flame Monks, they were originally flame monks from the mountaintops of giants. They were completely enthralled by another god-killing flame, but when they saw the true power of the black flame that the Godskin apostles used, they basically joined them out of fear. They saw that the black flame was the true power in the world, and they had to abandon their old cult of fire for a new cult of fire. And aside from them, there's also the very Midsommar style celebrants. These A24 style enemies really took to the skinning aspect of the Godskins culture, so much so that they practice it themselves, and they seem to have some sort of festival that celebrates the Godskin apostle who's in town, and by celebrating them, they offer him tributes of skin, perhaps their own skin, or perhaps the skin of these unfortunate ghosts who we have begging and screaming in agony. I don't know, I really like Dominula Village. It's a real fun bit of subtle world building. But anyways, if you subscribe to the theory that the beast eye that Geraint gives you to hunt Deathroot is actually Melina's eye, then it can be said that her death eye outlives her, and that this eye is actually the last remnants of her remains, if you will. I mean, it's a very living eye that's trapped in stone, I guess, to preserve it, but it moves around and writhes like a living eye, so I really do think it's safe to say that it is either, the Glowm-eyed Queen's eye, or maybe it's one of Geraint's eyes. Honestly, I don't know. I'm leaning toward it being the Glowm eye, obviously, but who knows? But I think that's everything I wanted to get into in this video. I know I probably got off topic at a few points, but that's the nature of these. I want to do a part 2 where I talk about the outer gods and maybe their influences as well, but I have a couple other things that are going to come out before I can get started on that. As always, though, I hope you guys found this video to be at least somewhat informative or amusing or entertaining, and if you liked it, please like it. If you dislike it, please dislike it. And if you like hearing me ramble on about various video game topics and very soon lots of movie and TV show topics, then please consider subscribing because it really helps. And if for some crazy reason you feel like supporting the channel, please consider hitting up the Patreon. I just opened it up kind of recently. I'm going to start doing maybe a weekly sort of podcast thing there to do updates where we just talk about random shit, or maybe it'll be a stream. I'm not quite sure. I got to figure out how streaming works before I do that, but something's coming really soon for exclusive. But the main purpose of the Patreon is to just help fund the channel because, man, everything's getting so goddamn expensive in life. But as always, I hate e-begging. I really fucking do. But I'm just a simple one-man channel here, and any support really does help me out. And it's always much appreciated. Trying to get back up to having more than one upload a week, but it's been a really busy season. I know I always say that, but man, it just feels like I can never have enough time to finish all these ambitious plans of mine. But it's starting to look good, There should be another video out in less than a week. I can't say which one it will be though. Just know there's a lot of good stuff planned, and that's enough rambling for now. Let's have our outro and then some final thoughts on this video and future videos. Alright, so yeah, this video really just came about from me just noticing that several of the demigods left some form of remains behind. You know, they left saints' corpses, if you will, because, you know, they're technically the saints of the Shattering since they died. A less optimistic version to look at them as was, of course, sacrifices for the outcome of the Shattering, but I like to view them more as saints. And I almost want to title this video, The Corpses of Saints, but, you know, I need to really work on my titling and my thumbnailing, because clearly they aren't quite hitting like they used to. But maybe it's not the thumbnail, maybe it's the title. I mean, honestly, this is all random stuff that doesn't really need to be said in a video, is it? Yeah, I'm getting a little off topic here. My next video should probably be the Dark Souls 2 enemies one that I'm working on. Then I've got one on all the endings of Elden Ring. Yeah, I know, it's like 2.5 years too late from when everybody else did their lore videos on the endings. But I've had a lot of time to marinate on what I think about the ending, so I just felt like it was time to make a video about it. That prospect video I've been talking about for years is also coming too. I just have to do a couple edits and maybe change a couple things around so I can get past the old copyright machine. Aside from all those and a couple things I can't remember, I've been gathering footage to make a series of 3 videos about one about America, one about Miquella, and then one about the Black Knives. But those shouldn't take too long because I got most of the footage I need already. I just need a few clips I'm missing, and I just need to record the audio on them. So yeah, we got a lot of stuff coming. I really like this part of the year, and so I finally might be able to do the first of many Twin Peaks videos that I've been wanting to do, because this is the time of the year I like to rewatch it. So if that's something you're into, stay tuned, because that could be coming as well. But yeah, as always, I think that's where I'm gonna sign off. Happy winter. It's the best part of the year. You gotta enjoy them while we still got them, they say. Although I don't know about you guys, but I live in California. It just feels like it's getting colder here each year for the winter. And, you know, for the summer, it does feel like it's also getting hotter each year, too, for that matter. So who knows? Maybe I'm just getting less resilient. But as always, I hope you guys are well, and I will see you next time. Until then, stay safe, and see ya.
My body may be shackled, but my mind wanders free.